Hi, I'm Marie Segaris from Underground Crafter, and today I'm here to talk with you about the project for today's Mod B, which is quilted placemats with crochet edgings. And I'm going to share a couple of things before we get started on the project. So firstly, I'm going to talk about the materials and tools. Now, if you are here at Mod B, I assume you probably are already a quilter or a sewer, but just in case you aren't, I'm going to share that for this particular project, it would be best to use 100% cotton quilting fabric, and that's pretty straightforward. I used fat quarters for my version, and each one is a little bit different because I use different fat quarters, but you could also use cut yardage. Because I used fat quarters, maybe they're each a little bit shorter than they might have been perhaps if I used yardage, because as we all know, every fat quarter is not created equal. So on some of them I had to trim the edges a little bit, but I did make all of my placemats to be the same size, even though I made each one to be a little bit unique. And what I like about that is when people are eating at the table, they can each have their own placemat, but of course you could make them four identically the same if you prefer. So besides the fabric, of course we'll need the yarn, and the same way you'll want to use 100% cotton yarn. I used yarn that is called King Cole Cotton Soft DK. DK is the weight or the thickness of yarn, double knitting it's also called, or number 3 weight yarn, depending on what country you're in. The yarn weights have different names. I prefer using that weight of yarn for my quilted projects. A 4 weight or a medium weight yarn that's thicker than this, I think sometimes overpowers the stitching of the quilted piece, and a yarn that's a lot thinner than this, sometimes I feel it's almost too frilly looking and it doesn't really go well with a pattern that has been quilted and has all the 3 layers. So I find that DK is sort of the perfect in-between yarn weight, so number 3 yarn weight. Along with our crocheting part of the project, you'll also need a crochet hook, and I use these ones. They're very comfortable. If you have arthritis or any other hand issues, I highly recommend them. However, you could use really any crochet hook. It doesn't have to be a fancy one. And what I would suggest if you haven't crocheted before is taking a set of hooks is probably the best choice, because you'll want to try a couple of different hook sizes. Every one of us crochets a little bit tighter or a little bit looser than the next person, so it's hard to say exactly what crochet hook a person would need for a certain thickness of yarn, because somebody that has very tight stitches, their stitches would be a lot smaller, and someone that has very loose stitches, their stitches would be a lot bigger. When you're first learning to crochet, it's harder to change the tightness or the looseness of your stitches because you're still kind of learning all the motor skills that you need in order to crochet at all. So for that reason, if you can get a set of a couple of different sizes of crochet hooks together, that will give you the best chance of finding the perfect fit for this particular yarn weight and for this particular project. For this particular thickness of yarn, the double knitting or number 3 yarn that I've talked about, there are 3 main hook sizes that would be recommended. So if you were getting a set of a couple hooks, these are the ones you'd want to look for. The first one is a G hook, and that is the US sizing. It's also called a 4mm crochet hook. I know it's confusing, but I do have a PDF with all this information, so hopefully it's not stressing you out too much. The other size is an H hook, which is also sometimes called an 8 hook in the United States and is also a 5mm hook. And finally, the last size is an I hook, which is also sometimes called a 9 hook or a 5.5mm hook. So I'm using the G hook, which was the 4mm number 6 hook for this particular project. Again, my stitches tend to be tighter, so that's the size that works for me, but other people might find a slightly bigger or a slightly smaller hook works better. Okay, so now we have the fabric, we have the crochet yarn, and we have the crochet hook out of the way. What other tools will you need to crochet onto fabric. You'll need all your standard tools that you're already using for quilting. So a rotary cutter and a mat and an acrylic ruler. All that is great. You'll need your sewing pins, you'll need your sewing machine, your thread. You can do this by hand, by the way. I just don't do that by hand. I'm not a big hand sewer, but you could sew this project by hand as well. So all those normal sewing and quilting supplies you'll need. And then what else? So I also use a skip cut rotary blade. So this is a type of blade that makes small holes that are evenly spaced on your project, and we're going to use those small holes to set a foundation for the crochet stitches. Now you can take a skip cut blade and you can attach it to any rotary cutter that you already have. You just change it out for the other blade that's already there. However, personally, because I do a fair amount of these crochet and sewing projects that are combined, I prefer to use a separate rotary cutter that's just for my skip cut blade. Then I don't have to constantly be changing it on and off. I don't have to worry because some rotary cutters, as you know, the pieces are not always that friendly getting back on when you're changing the blades. So it just, for me, it works easier to have a separate blade or a separate rotary cutter that I use with my skip cut blade, and then my standard rotary cutter that I use for just cutting fabric. The particular skip cut blade that I use, it's a 45mm and it's for wide space cuts. And this is the one that I use is from June Taylor. June Taylor also has their own rotary cutters. If you find it easier to use from the same brand, that's an option as well. Another tool that you're going to need is a yarn needle or a tapestry needle. And the ones that I use are from Clover. They're called chibi needles, and they have a bent tip. I find that the bent tip makes this a lot easier to work with when you are going in between the various layers of a quilted piece. But you can use any type of needle that has a large eye. Okay, so you need the large eye because the yarn is going to go through it, and a thin eye needle is only made for thread, and it's going to be impossible to get your yarn through it. And you also want a tip that is somewhat blunt, and that's because you're going to be pulling this thread in and out a lot of times, or the yarn I should say, and you probably don't want to be pricking your fingers and things like that. You will have the skip cut blade to make the holes in the fabric, so you don't need a sharp needle to make holes into the fabric, and so you'll find that this blunt tip and the curved tip is just a lot easier to use. So that's your tapestry needles. Now, as far as your batting for the very small quilt sandwich that we'll be making with each placemat, you want to choose a low loft batting, and the main reason for that is again just sort of an aesthetic reason. When you're putting the yarn and then you're also having the quilted piece, I find that when the batting is really thick, it sometimes is thicker than the yarn, and so that kind of has an unusual look aesthetically where the yarn is almost like, you know, it's like recessed almost. So if you want your quilted piece to be, you know, basically the same thickness, which is what I have here, then you're going to want to use a lower loft piece of batting. Now, one more thing about your supplies. I know a lot of quilters will have already washed their fabrics because that's what they like to do to make sure that they've pre-shrunk them. However, it's almost impossible to pre-wash yarn. And because the yarn is also 100% cotton, it's also going to shrink slightly. So what I recommend is if you're not working from fabric in your stash and you don't already have the fabric washed, to cut your fabric from unwashed pieces of cotton fabric, and then to wash the whole completed project together for the first time. And so what that'll do is it'll allow the yarn and the fabric to shrink kind of together because they're both 100% cotton. And so that way you don't have where, let's say, the fabric piece has already been pre-shrunk and then the cotton shrinks the cotton yarn shrinks a little bit, and so you have a piece that's a little bit more cohesive. Now that we have talked through all the supplies, let's get started on making our quilted placemats with a crochet shell edging. Okay, so let's talk about piecing the front together. You're going to have your strips that are cut as indicated in the PDF. And if you are using yardage, you will have very long strips. If you are using fat quarters, you will have shorter strips. You're going to basically pick 4 strips or 4 colors and piece those pieces together in the way that you like. And so essentially you're going to sew with a 1/4 inch seam along the long edge of each strip, and then you'll want to press the seam towards the darker color and then add the next strip and so on. And so eventually you will have a front that is pieced. Here's the one that I made earlier. And you can see that on the back I've pressed the seams towards the darker color. And once you have your tops pieced, what you're going to want to do is kind of just trim off any unusual edges. Okay, so what I do is I place the front piece and the batting and the back piece that I'm going to be using on my cutting table, and then I trim so that everything is sized to the front piece. So once you've done that trimming, what you're going to do is you're going to make a quilt sandwich, but it's a little bit different than most quilt sandwiches. So what you're going to do is you're going to put on the bottom the batting, then you're going to put the backing face up, and then you're going to put the front piece, which is pieced, the front piece that's pieced, face down. Okay, so you're going to have these 3 layers with the batting on the bottom, the back piece that's one piece in the middle facing up, and the top piece facing down, or side, right sides facing, is going to be your pieced front of the placemat. Once you have these 3 pieces together, you're going to sew a 1/2 inch seam around, and what you'll want to do is leave about, I would say, about close to 2 full strips open. So I usually start sort of on the 3rd strip from the top, and so this way around, and then come back and end sort of on the top of the 2nd stitch. And you'll have this opening that will allow you to turn your placemat right side out. Okay, so I made a teeny tiny version that we're going to use for the rest of the class. And as you can see, by the time you're done, it maybe will have shifted a little. And so you want to trim off any extra batting or extra layers because otherwise it's going to be a bit challenging to turn this right side out. And you can use your rotary cutter for this, of course, but for the video it was a little easier for me to use just a scissor. And you'll also want to clip your 4 corners, being careful not to cut off the seam. And again, that's just going to make it a little bit easier for you to turn this right side out. So when that's done, you're going to take the 2 fabric pieces and you're going to use them to pull the rest of the project right side out. Now, depending on how small you've made your hole, that's going to be a nightmare or it's going to be easy. But what you're going to probably struggle with no matter what are your corners. And I will tell you that your crochet hook has a secret purpose at this point to help you get really clean corners. Okay, so once you have this coming out, you're going to have corners that are probably a little bit lumpy. And so what I usually do is I take my crochet hook And gently, because I'm not trying to push through the seams or anything, I just push those corners out so they're a little bit more pointy. And at this point, your next step is going to be, well, first you're going to iron it, because most likely after your battle to turn it right side out, it'll be really terribly wrinkled. And then what you're going to do is you're going to create a 1/4 inch top stitch all the way around. You want to be sure that you're closing up this little bit of opening, and most likely it's already pointing inside, but just to make sure, you want to go ahead and do that all the way around. Okay, and then you're going to quilt it as desired. As I mentioned, I usually do stitching in the ditch for projects like this because I don't want the quilting to overpower the crochet. So I would just use my edge joining foot to go from the top stitch across on the lines of where my fabric was pieced, basically. But you can use any type of quilting that you prefer. So once we're done with that step, we're going to get to the fun part, which is adding our crochet. Okay, so now we have our finished placemat. Now I didn't quilt my tiny version because I'm not really going to use it as a placemat, but now the next piece is we're going to take our skip cut blade and we're going to create perforations around the edge. The way that we're going to do this is like this. You're going to line up your ruler so that it's probably, roughly about 1/8 of an inch, because it's going to be somewhere between the seam and the edge. I have these little notches on my ruler. I'm kind of going by those. I honestly don't know what the distance is. It doesn't really matter as long as you use the same distance all the way around. It will look just as good. Okay, so working with a skip cut blade is similar to any rotary cutting blade. You want to use all the same safety precautions. You want to use your dominant hand, hold the ruler in your non-dominant hand so you don't injure yourself. Here's the key difference, and I'll just put that aside while I tell you about it. We're not going to go all the way through with the skip cut blade. We're actually just going to be working between the seam lines. Okay, so think of this horizontal seam line as like a barrier, and this one is a barrier, and we're just creating skip cuts in between at some even distance from the seam and the edge of the fabric. Okay, so another thing to keep in mind with the skip cut blade, you're going through all 3 layers, right? Because you have your fabric, you have your batting, and you have your other fabric, and you also have some fabrics folded. So it's going to be kind of heavy layers. So you want to use a really firm pressure to make sure that the skip cuts are going through all the layers and not just the top layer. So I'm going to line up one of these little skips to the bottom of my seam here, and you can kind of hear it crunch down. And then from that crunch, I'm going to work across to the top. Okay, and then I'm going to turn my piece and I'm going to repeat the same thing on all the 4 sides. Now, I know you'll notice that this is not a perfect piece. First of all, I'm not a perfect quilter. That's just how I roll. But it's also a sample piece. But I want you to also feel that you don't have to be perfect either. This is your first try maybe doing crochet and quilting together. So try not to stress it too much. Again, I'm just using the tiny notch mark on mine. And again, you want to start with hearing that crunch and then rolling evenly across. And then we'll do our final edge and I'll show you kind of what it looks like. Okay, put that away safely. Now you're going to come up here. I think it's usually almost impossible to see them, which is sort of frustrating on the video. But hopefully you can see these little lines, these sort of perforated lines. Those are our skip cuts, and we're going to use those to add our crochet border now. Okay, now we're going to add our blanket stitch edging. And I'm going to use, as I mentioned, let me find the one that I like better, my bent tip needle. Depending on what size you got, These are great because they have a bigger eye and they're easier to see. However, they're a little less sharp, so harder to push through layers. So if this is your very first time, you may find this needle a little bit easier to work with, even though it's harder to thread. So we're going to take just about a yard of yarn to start with. Yes, we could use a huge piece of yarn and get the blanket stitch around our entire project in one try, but if it's your first time doing the blanket stitch, most likely what's going to happen is you're going to end up with a big tangled mess of yarn. So let's not do that. So we're going to thread the needle, and then we're going to tie a knot at the end, any kind of knot, leaving at least a few inches of slack on the end. And these few inches of yarn we're going to actually crochet over later, so they'll disappear, so don't worry about them or the knot. Then we're going to straighten out the rest of this yarn, and you can see it's already inclined to want to tangle itself, so it's a good thing we're not using such a long string. So we're going to start in any one of these four corners, and we're going to kind of use our needle to get in there in the seam. So we're going to be in between the front and the back piece of fabric, and what we're trying to find is our first skip cut on on the side that we're working towards. So for this action, I should say you're going to be holding the needle in your dominant hand, and your non-dominant hand is going to be doing a bunch of other jobs, and you should be moving from your dominant hand to your non-dominant hand. So I'm, for example, a right-hander, so I'm holding the needle in my right hand, I'm moving right to left. If you're a left-hander, you'll be holding your needle in your left hand. You'll be doing this a lot neater than I am, and you're going to be moving from left to right. Okay, so again, we're starting our needle in here, and we're taking it out through the front of our front pieced part of our placemat, and we're going to pull the yarn all the way through, and this is why we don't want to start with a huge piece, because you can see it's easy to get it kind of tangled because it has both layers. Okay, so what you're going to see is the knot is going to be on the outside and that extra yarn tail, and that's exactly the way we want it. And now you're going to find that same skip cut hole on the back of the fabric. Okay, and then you're going to push so that the needle is going from the back to the front through the same hole. Before you start pulling your yarn through, I want you to take the index finger on your non-dominant hand and put it between your yarn. So you have this sort of front loop, this back loop. You're going to hold your index finger, and then we're going to pull the yarn through. And you see, even with not a too long thing, it gets a little tangly, and that's okay. We're going to keep the loop on our index finger until it gets pretty small. Then we're going to put the needle through the loop on our index finger. Now we can release our index finger, and we're going to pull the yarn all the way through. Okay, so now let's go to our next skip cut piece. We probably, depending on our fabric, we might do that by feel. So you can see if I just kind of move my needle, it goes through somewhere. I don't see the hole, but apparently it's there. Same thing, I'm going to use the index finger on my non-dominant hand to hold up the yarn. And then I'm going to start pulling that yarn through. Okay, and this is what we call a blanket stitch. When it gets to the part where it's kind of tough to hold it on my index finger, then I'm going to pull the needle through, again working from the direction of my non-dominant hand away to the, working from the direction of my dominant hand to my non-dominant hand, and then I'm going to pull it through, being careful not to tangle stuff like I just almost did there. Okay, so what you'll see from this first one is that when we push through the skip cut blade, we create a little vertical line, and when we grab that stitch on our loop that we've been holding in our index finger, we create a little horizontal line. And the little horizontal line is what is going to hold our crochet in place. So our little vertical lines are basically there for decorative purposes. So let's continue doing that. So again, you're going to be moving from your dominant hand towards your non-dominant hand. Use your needle to help you find the next skip cut. Place your index finger and then pull that yarn all the way through. Once your index finger is getting snug around there, then you're going to take the needle and pull it through that little loop, being sure not to tangle, and then you're going to pull everything tightly. Okay, and we're going to keep doing that until we get to the edge of this piece. And when we get to the edge, we're going to do something a little bit different. Now let me talk about some troubleshooting while we're here. What happens if you have one big loop and one little loop? No worries, you're just going to tug on these two strands till they kind of even out. So that's not a problem. It's even not a problem if you've already pulled the yarn, because until you make the next stitch, you have a little bit of flexibility in adjusting just by pulling these two strands apart. Where it gets troublesome is if you don't notice for a couple of stitches, but even then it's not a nightmare. So just keep going and we'll talk about how to deal with that later. So again, we're going to keep working, in my case, from right to left. If you're a lefty, from left to right. You're going to just keep working this blanket stitch across to the edge, and then I'll show you the next step from there. Actually, I fibbed. Let me show you a little troubleshooting. So here I accidentally skipped this cut in between, so you can see just from looking at them that there's just a wider space between these two stitches. If you notice this right away, you can solve it pretty quickly. If you don't notice it until later, there's a crochet way we can solve it too. But if you notice it right away, just go back to the stitch that you skipped, work your blanket stitch like normal. Okay, and being a little more careful about the tangling because it's easier to do when there's a bigger gap between the stitches. Okay, and then you're going to skip the one you just made and move on to the next one. So that'll give you still the horizontal piece. You'll have all the stitches that you're supposed to have, so it'll be evenly worked around, and nobody will know that you made that mistake because most of this is going to get covered up by crochet anyway, so it'll not really matter. That's another thing that I should mention. If you feel like your little knots are sort of tangly and they're not perfect, again, this is all going to get covered up with crochet, this whole horizontal piece, so I really wouldn't worry about it. Okay, when we get to the edge and we have our last skip cut on this side, before we turn, what are we supposed to do here? So we're still going to be making a blanket stitch, but it's going to be a little bit different. So we're going to insert from the back to the front. We're going to still be using our forefinger to kind of guide the yarn, but this time we're going to let the yarn have a little bit more slack because it's going to cover this whole edge here. So we're not going to tighten it all the way up, we're going to let it be loose like that. And then we're going to stick our needle through it again and continue working across. And we'll repeat that on each corner, so I'll do that again when we get to the next corner so you can see it a little bit better. So it's the same thing, but we're just being a little bit looser with our yarn slack so that the horizontal piece can sort of curve across the edge of our project. So while we're talking about the blanket stitch, can you use other things than yarn? Yes, some people prefer to use embroidery floss for this part. Personally, I like to be a little more cohesive with colors, so that's why I like to use the same yarn to lay down the blanket stitch as I use for the crochet patterns itself. I also find that some people, you know, you may have a machine that has a blanket stitch, and that's an option if you like to do that. There's other ways you could use actually a heavier embroidery needle that's got a sharper tip, and you could use that to push through all the 3 layers of fabric without the skip cut blade, but I find that's really straining on my hand and also pretty straining on my needles too. I find that a lot of them bend and break. I also personally am not as evenly spaced as a skip cut blade is, so when I've done that, it ends up that my project has sort of really uneven stitching on the edge, and that's why I really recommend the skip cut blades. I think they're just so much easier for this part. Like, as you can see, it's really simple to just put the stitches through. It's not sort of a nightmare. Even there on the seam, I'm not really fighting with the fabric, and that's kind of what happens when I'm using my own force to just push through rather than following the holes of the skip cut. Now, a couple things I'm going to mention. We're getting sort of close to running out of thread, and so I'm going to show you how to add a new thread. As I said, you could choose to cut a huge piece of thread, and that would probably, you'd want to take the perimeter of your project, so all of the sides, and do probably 12 times around. It ends up being a lot of yarn, and depending on how tight you pull the stitches, you may not need it all, or you may even need more anyway, and it ends up usually getting pretty tangly, which is sort of not so fun to work with. Okay, so I'm going to let us get to this, around this corner, and then we're going to cut the thread. I'll show you how to add a new one. So again, on our corner, we're going to go into the first skip cut on the following side. We're going to do everything the same, but just ever so slightly looser with this loop so that it comes around the curve of the edge. Then we'll pull it through. So we can snip the thread here, and we can create a knot here. Now again, we want to leave as much extra yarn, at least an inch or two, but probably 2 or 3 is better, on the edge here, because we're going to actually crochet over that later. So don't worry about leaving that extra knot thread. And then it looks like, for me at least, I got about halfway around. So I'm going to try to take, hopefully this is about the same length as whatever yarn I chose before. And just again to remind you, we're going to thread the needle. Then we're going to look for the other cut thread. Of our yarn. We're going to make a knot with a couple of inches to spare. And any type of knot will do. And then we're going to try to untangle by bringing our needle towards the center. Oops. Of this giant loop that we've created. Also, I should mention why I'm using 2 layers of yarn. I think it makes a sturdier placemat that stands up to being used more often. It's not required though. If you really, really want to use a thinner look, that's also fine. So I'm going to start, when I'm adding the new yarn, kind of similar to what I did when I did it before, where I came from the center, except I'm going to come from underneath the loop of the previous stitch. Okay, so again here we're going to have these 2 knots because we joined the yarn, but that's okay. Don't pull this all the way through because the knot will fly right through. Just leave it there. When we crochet over, it'll get more secure. Then I'm going to find my next skip cut, and I'm going to repeat my process of using my index finger to hold a loop in my yarn, bringing my needle through, and then pulling that across. Okay, so maybe I made this a little too loose. It's sticking out a little bit, so I can pull it forward a tiny bit because I'm still on this stitch, which means I can still adjust this thread. Okay, so there you go. That's maybe a little bit firmer. Yeah, so it's not as scary to adjust if you don't panic. As soon as you panic, the thread gets tighter. It becomes a lot harder to deal with it. So just try to remain calm. It's like, they tell you on the airplane, remain calm. Okay, so all the way across and around. And then when we're done with this, we'll go to the part where we're going to actually add the crochet stitches. Okay, so here we are. We are all the way around. We're at our kind of last blanket stitch before our original knot. How do we finish off? We're going to put our needle under our very first blanket stitch, and we're going to pull this thread through, or the yarn through, leaving a little bit of slack like we have around every corner. And then we're going to create a knot here, as we've done at the beginning and end of every sort of yarn tail. And again, it doesn't really matter the type of knot that you choose because you're going to be crocheting over the knot anyway. And then you want to cut off, leaving a yarn tail that's a couple inches long so that we can crochet over that later. Okay, so here is our piece. We're now going to crochet onto it. I recommend choosing a corner where you don't have a whole bunch of knots to start with. It's just a lot easier to deal with everything that's around you. Okay, so you're going to start with some yarn. Just like with these knots, you'll want to leave a few inches at the beginning and end, and I'll show you later how to deal with those. You're going to hold the crochet hook in your dominant hand. Most crochet hooks have something called a thumb rest, where there's a part that's either thicker or wider. There's some sort of part that's a little bit different, and that's where your thumb should go. I use what's called the knife blade technique, so I hold it like a knife. If it's more comfortable for you, you can also hold it like a pencil, but in either case, you want to put your thumb on the thumb rest of the hook. That's the part that will give you the most control over the hook. It will also be the most ergonomic fit that's less likely to cause cramping. So you're going to start in that corner loop that we created, and you're going to insert your hook from the front to the back underneath that loop that's on the corner. Okay, then with your non-dominant hand, so you're going to hold the hook in your dominant hand. In your non-dominant hand, you're going to leave a few inches of yarn, and then you're going to put that yarn over your hook and use your forefinger to control the long piece of yarn that's coming from the yarn ball. And you're going to slowly pull through that loop. Okay, so that will give you one loop that's on your crochet hook. Now we're going to make the first crochet stitch that I'm going to show you. It's called the chain, and the chain is very similar to what we've just done. We're going to wrap the yarn counterclockwise over the hook, and then we're going to pull the hook towards our dominant hand and through that loop. And that's how we're going to make a chain. We only need one chain for this part, but I'm going to show it to you again because I know a lot of folks may have trouble getting this. If you've already know how to chain, just sit back for a moment, relax. But if you don't know how to chain, this is how you do it. We'll show you again. So you're going to take the yarn in your non-dominant hand. You're going to wrap it counterclockwise from the back to the front of the crochet hook. You're going to pull the crochet hook towards your dominant hand and pull it through that loop. Okay, so we'll do it one more time. And again, if you know how to do a chain, you don't have to do it one more time, and we'll also show how to do it again later. But if you don't know how to chain, just make a few extras here. So we're going to go take our yarn from the yarn ball, and we're going to wrap it counterclockwise from the back around to the front of the hook. Then we're going to pull our hook through that loop, and you'll get these little tiny pieces of sort of like a V, little loops. These are called chains. Now if you've made the extras with me, since we only need one, slowly take your hook out of that last loop, put it down here into the first loop. That's going to prevent it from unraveling. And then we're going to pull the yarn, and voila, we're back to our first chain. So again, yarn over, pull through one loop. So we should have one chain here. Now we're going to work a stitch that's called a single crochet. Okay, so we're going to do a little bit of math here. You're going to want to end up with a multiple of 6 of these single crochets plus an extra one. So for example, 24 plus 1 would be 25, 18 plus 1 would be 19, and so on. So when you look at how many blanket stitches you have, for most of us, we could probably fit 2 single crochets between each one. So we want to figure out how many multiples of 6 we think we could fit on a whole side. In this first loop here, I'm going to do my first single crochet. So I'm going to insert my hook under that horizontal bar that my blanket stitch made. Then I'm going to wrap the yarn around from the back to the front counterclockwise. Just like with the chain, I'm going to pull the hook through that first loop. Except now I'm going to have 2 loops on my hook because I also went through the horizontal bar. So now that I have those 2 loops on my hook, I'm going to yarn over. That's what we call it when we move the yarn counterclockwise from the back to the front, and I'm going to pull it through those 2 loops. And that was a whole single crochet. Now I'm working super loose right now. You can work tighter if you're more comfortable. You may work looser than me, you may work tighter than me, and that's why I talked about using different hooks to get the kind of right fit for you. But let's try another one. So we're going to insert our hook under that next horizontal bar that we made with our next blanket stitch. Then we're going to wrap the yarn from the back to the front counterclockwise. We're going to pull the hook under that first loop, and we should have 2 loops on our hook. Then we're going to wrap the yarn counterclockwise again, and we're going to pull it through those 2 loops, and we'll have 2 loops again. So I'm making 2 single crochets in each of my blanket stitches. So you may be able to fit 1 or 2, but we'll try it again. So if it's 2, we're going to go under that very same horizontal bar. We're going to yarn over, and you see that as you get more comfortable, instead of physically taking your whole arm to do that, you may just use your index finger to move the yarn around. Okay, but if you don't feel comfortable to do that yet, it's okay to make this larger motion. And then we're going to pull the yarn through. We have 2 loops on our hook, and yarn over and pull through 2 loops on our hook. I'm going to do it a little bit faster now. I'm going to insert the hook. I'm going to yarn over and pull through 1 loop, and then I'm going to yarn over and pull through 2 loops. So let's keep doing this all the way across. So always what we're doing is inserting our hook under the horizontal bar, which is that little bar of yarn from our blanket stitch. We're going to bring the yarn over and then through that horizontal bar, leaving us with 2 loops, and then bring the yarn over and through those 2 loops. And we're going to keep doing that all the way across. Okay, and like I said, I'm doing 2 under each of these horizontal bars. You may find that you have bigger stitches than me, smaller stitches than me. Maybe you can get 3 in, maybe 1 is all that fits. That's okay. And we're just going to keep making these single crochets all the way across. Now, if I was making this placemat for someone who prefers sort of less frilly, more kind of simple patterns, I would just end on this row that we're going to do here. I usually put the shells because I like the way they look, but if you're working with making a project for someone who is maybe not as into the frills, this stitch itself is pretty laid back. It's pretty mellow, so you can just sort of do that. Now, you may be wondering, oh man, I was listening to you, Marie, and I totally lost count. How many do I have? How do I find out? When we look on the top edge, we're going to see these kind of loops that are sort of like V's. Each one of those V's is a stitch. So I would count these. I could say 1 V, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16. So I already have 16 of these. So now I'm going to start thinking about Remember I said multiples of 6. So something that if you feel more comfortable with the single crochet you might want to do, if you've already done single crochets before, is to count them off in 6 so that you know how many multiples of 6 that you have. If you're not as familiar with the single crochet, it's going to take you longer, and that's okay. Okay, so when we get to that corner loop that's kind of curvy, this is another time where it's good to count our stitches if we didn't do that along the way. So now I have my 31. Remember those chains we did way back when? We're going to make 3 of those. So we're going to yarn over, pull that yarn through the loop on our hook. Yarn over again from back to front counterclockwise, pull that loop through the hook, the one on our hook. And one more time, yarn over and pull through the loop. So that's 3. Now we're going to repeat our single crochets across this next side. The way that we're going to do that, when you have your project, I'm using a sample piece that's basically square, but on your project it's rectangular. So remember I talked about having those multiples of 6 stitches plus 1 extra stitch on each side. You're going to kind of, if I were you, this is how I would do it. I would write down how many stitches do I have on this side. I'm going to repeat the same thing when I get to that side. And then, or put it in your phone, whatever you find is helpful for you to remember stuff. And then the same thing when I work across this edge. That's going to be the same length as this edge opposite to it, so I'm going to kind of write down how many stitches I did. But once I have my 3 chains, I'm going to start that row back in this corner space. And the reason is because this corner space, remember, it was a little bit bigger than all of our other spaces that we have. So we're going to maybe have a little extra room for some stitches there. I'm going to show you also another trick, which is how you can crochet over these yarn tails, and that way it's easier than some other methods you can use. However, if you find this overwhelming, there are other ways we can deal with the yarn tails later. So again, everyone is coming to this class at a different level with crochet. If you've never crocheted before and you're just sort of like, gosh, I really need to get that single crochet down, I wouldn't worry about this next piece. If you already feel confident with the single crochet, I'm going to show you how you can crochet over your yarn tails. So you're going to make your single crochet again in this corner space in that same corner stitch. Now for these yarn tails, you're going to lay them kind of horizontally, and as you put your hook under your horizontal blanket stitch loop, you're also going to put it under these yarn tails. Then you're going to take your yarn and you're going to single crochet, but look at what I'm doing here. This is my yarn that I'm wrapping. I'm going to pull it underneath all of these different loops, and that's going to capture these yarn tails inside of this stitch. And then I'm going to yarn over and finish my single crochet, and now you'll see that the yarn tails are inside of this. If I pull on them or if I do stuff to them, you can see they'll get less visible. So I'm going to do that again, showing how to crochet over the yarn tails. Again, if you're totally new to single crochet and you don't feel comfortable with it, don't worry about this part. Just leave your yarn tails hanging out behind your project, and we will show you another way to cover them up later. So for those of you that feel comfortable with this, you're going to insert your hook underneath the horizontal part of your blanket stitch and underneath these yarn tails. Then you're going to bring the yarn, wrap it over, yarn over. Remember, that's from back to front. Pull that through. When I have these 2 loops here and yarn over, I'm going to kind of trap all of these extra yarn tails inside. I'm going to keep doing that until I get to where these yarn tails are a little bit short. And as they get shorter, I'm still going underneath my blanket stitch, making sure to capture all of that. As I get shorter and shorter on these yarn tails, I'm going to give the yarn tails a little tug just to make sure that I don't have any bumps or anything in my yarn tails. And then you can point any extra yarn tails towards the back. I'll tell you how to totally finish them later. And then we're going to just keep working our single crochet across. Now remember, we want a multiple of 6 single crochet plus 1 extra. So on each side. On every corner where we have our little curvy blanket stitch here, we're going to end with those 3 chains before we start along the next side. Again, the chain is where we wrap the yarn over counterclockwise and we pull it through the loop, and we're going to do that 2 more times. And then we're going to crochet along this edge, put our 3 chains, crochet along this edge. So I'm going to catch you up when we're here and I'll show you what to do next. Okay, so now I've done my single crochets all around and I'm at that first corner that I started in, and I'm going to end with my 3 chains again, which is going to be the yarn over from the back to the front counterclockwise and pull the hook through the loop, and we're going to repeat that 3 times. Now I'm going to do something called a slip stitch. This is really in this context, it's a joining stitch. So I'm going to insert my hook under that very first single crochet that I made way back when. I think it's easier if you put your hook underneath both of those V's, but you can also put the hook in between. It's your preference. And then just like the chain, we're going to yarn over, but this time we're going to pull it through both loops on the hook. Ta-da! Okay, so now what are we going to do? This is our first row, our single crochet row, and to be honest, if like I said earlier, if you were making these placemats, let's say to gift to somebody, like if I was making these for my dad, I know he wouldn't want the lacy edges, so I would just kind of be done here. And I'll show you in a moment how to finish when those of us that want the fancy edges get those edges. Then I'll show everyone else how to finish, because it's the same finishing whether you had fancy edges or non-fancy edges. These are called shells. Just like in quilting, how we have different applique motifs, we have the same kind of idea in crochet. So if you wanted to have these decorative shells, what do you do next? This is a little bit more complicated, and you may want to keep your PDF pattern near you just to keep track of this, because this is where that multiple of 6 comes in handy. Each one of these shells is made out of 6 stitches. And so every time we have this thing going on, we're doing 6 different stitches. So I'm going to show you that process a few times. So first we're going to start in that same stitch that we just joined with the slip stitch. We're going to make a chain. And in crocheting, we often do a chain when we're starting what we call a new round. So we made 1 round that we completed sort of like 1 length of stitches. Now we're going to put the next layer on top, and it's common to put a chain in between those layers. We're going to make a single crochet into that same stitch that we just did. So again, that same single crochet that we've been doing, except now instead of putting it into the horizontal bar of the blanket stitch, we're going to go into the loops of that single crochet. Then we're going to yarn over and pull through. We'll have our 2 loops, and then we're going to yarn over and pull through both loops. That's our single crochet. Now we're going to do 5 double crochets, but first we're going to skip 2 single crochets. So we're going to skip 2 of these V's. In the 3rd V is where we're going to work all these stitches. So the double crochet is different than any stitch we've done yet. We're going to wrap the yarn around first. So we're going to yarn over first. So we're already going to have 2 loops on the hook. Then we're going to skip our 2 stitches, and we're going to insert our hook into the 3rd stitch. So now we'll have effectively 3 loops on the hook. Now we're going to yarn over again. We're going to pull that through the first loop, and we'll still have 3 loops. And we're going to yarn over again and pull through 2 loops, and we're going to do that once more. Yarn over and pull through 2 loops. Now if you're feeling confused, I do have a link to a tutorial just for this stitch, so you can watch it over and over in the pattern. but we're going to do four more in this same spot. So it's supposed to be 5 double crochets all together. That was our first one. So we're going to wrap the yarn over. We're going to insert into that same stitch. How can we tell it's the same stitch? Well, if we tug on our double crochet that we just did, it'll sort of pull up that loop so we know that's the right one. So we're going to put our hook in there. Now we have 3 loops. We're going to yarn over, pull through 1 loop, yarn over, pull through 2 loops, and yarn over, pull through 2 loops again. So that's 2 double crochets. We got 5 to go, or 5 in total, so that's 3 more to go. Yarn over, insert your hook into the same stitch, yarn over and pull through 1 loop, yarn over and pull through 2 loops, and yarn over and pull through 2 loops again. That's 3 double crochets. We've got 2 more to go. So we're going to yarn over, insert, oops, let me make sure I'm in the right spot. Okay, insert our hook into the same stitch, yarn over and pull through 1 loop, yarn over and pull through 2 loops, and yarn over and pull through 2 loops, and that's 1, 2, 3, 4 double crochets. We'll do that one more time in the same stitch, yarn over, insert our hook, yarn over and draw up a loop, yarn over and draw through 2 loops, and yarn over and draw through 2 loops. So we have our very first shell there, and so that's taken 6 stitches. It has our first single crochet and our 5 double crochets. We're skipping 2 on each side of the double crochet, so altogether that's going to be 6 stitches. And now we're going to repeat that all the way across. By repeating that, I mean we're going to skip 2, we're going to insert our hook into the next stitch and make a single crochet, just 1. So yarn over and pull up a loop, yarn over and pull through 2 loops. That's our single crochet. Then we're going to skip 2 and we're going to make 5 double crochets into the next. Again, that's yarn over, insert the hook into the next stitch, yarn over and pull up a loop, yarn over and pull through 2 loops, and yarn over and pull through 2 loops, and we're going to repeat that so that we're going to do that 5 times into that same stitch. So we're going to do this all the way across this side of our placemat or of our swatch, whichever one that you're working with. And 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. When we get to the very last time, when we skip 2, there's only going to be space for a single crochet, the edge of this row. And so when we get there, I'm going to catch up with you and I'm going to show you what to do in the corner because it's a little bit different. Okay, so what happens when you get to a corner after you've done your shells and you've ended with your last single crochet? You will have this tiny little loop formed by your 3 chains that you did before. So you're going to insert your hook into those 3 chains, or rather I should say the space formed by those 3 chains. It's actually called the chain 3 space for those of you that are interested in crochet. And we're going to work a single crochet in that space. So we're going to yarn over, pull through the 3 chain loop or chain 3 loop, and then yarn over and pull through 2 loops. And now we're going to chain 3 again. 1, 2, 3, apologies for the ambulance. And then we're going to put our hook back into that same chain 3 space, which is like a little opening, so it'll be kind of easy to find, and do another single crochet. So basically a single crochet, 3 chains, and a single crochet into the chain 3 space. Now we're going to work the same way across each side. So we're going to start with the single crochet in the first stitch. Then we're going to skip 2, we're going to do 5 double crochets into the next stitch. Then we're going to skip 2, and we're going to repeat that all the way across to the very last stitch of the row, where we'll put a single crochet. And then when we get to that next chain 3 space, we're going to single crochet, chain 3, and single crochet all into that same space. Now I'm going to work across this row, and then I'm going to share, how you finish your project and take care of it. One of the pluses of working with crochet 100% cotton yarn is you can basically treat it the same way you would treat your quilting fabric, So when I'm done with this project, I can iron it just like I would iron a quilt or something that I've quilted. I can wash it the same way. I do recommend, depending on how much quilting that you've done, because I didn't necessarily describe a lot of the quilting process, you may want to hand wash it if you haven't quilted it following the manufacturer's instructions in terms of how much space between each quilt line, because if you've kind of cut a little bit of corners like I did on mine, you may find that, you know, the batting will start to kind of, you know, get messy if you throw it in the washing machine, just because you haven't quilted, let's say, every 2 inches or whatever the guidelines were. So I usually hand wash these, and I have 2 preferred washes that I like. One is, or actually they're both made by Unicorn, and I have them listed in the PDF. They're a company that makes fiber wash. You could use any fiber wash though. If you have another, you know, even anything like Wool Light you could use, or Soak, or gosh, I'm probably pronouncing this terribly wrong, but I think it's Eucalan or Eusalon. I'm not sure how it's pronounced, but you can really use any fiber wash that is sort of gentle on fabrics to clean these. But the reason I like the Unicorn is because they have one called Scour Power or something like that. And that one actually does a great job of removing stains. Like I had actually on one of my crochet projects, I had tomato sauce splatter on it, and it had a huge tomato sauce stain, and I was traveling at the time, so I didn't have anything to wash it with, and it kind of set in, which was awful. And so when I came home, I used the Scour Power, and it pulled it right up, and it doesn't damage the fabric, so that's great. Okay, so here I am on my last single crochet, and then my last corner chain 3 space, where I'm going to single crochet and chain 3 and then single crochet into the same stitch. Now I'm right back at the beginning, so I'm going to end with a slip stitch. I'm going to insert my hook into my very first single crochet, yarn over, and pull through both loops. And then I'm going to cut my yarn tail, leaving a few inches of slack. Now, how do I finish it, right? Because you don't want all this crazy stuff happening on the back. So as you can see, these are the backs that I crocheted over. I'm just going to pull them to make sure that I don't have any bubbles or anything. And then I'm going to carefully, and probably thread snips are better than fabric shears for this, I'm going to carefully trim that. And voila, it's gone. And then I'm going to do the same on this one. I had one other one that was kind of short that I'm going to do that. Now wherever I have the long yarn tail still hanging, I'm not going to do that. And the reason is because these yarn tails, if I just clipped it right on the knot, it can actually unravel. So I'm going to take that very same needle I used way back when to put on my blanket stitch, and I'm going to thread it with the yarn tail. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to just go, think about it as going where your hook would have been, so kind of in between the stitches. And I'm just going to insert that needle for a bit, maybe an inch or 2 through the stitches. And then I'm going to pull it through, and that yarn is going to disappear right behind the stitches. It's helpful to create a little bit of friction. This actually prevents it from unraveling. So now, not going into the same hole, because then you'll just pull the yarn through, but going into another stitch, maybe one stitch over, and doing the same process where you put your needle through the loops. We're going to pull the yarn through again. Ta-da! And now that little bit of friction of having the 2 yarns together like that will keep it from unraveling even when I wash it. So I can just clip it. This one we had already crocheted in for a few inches, so I'm going to clip that too. And then this one I do need to go through with the yarn needle again. Now sometimes if you didn't hand wash it, because you're naughty, you decided to throw it in the washing machine, oops, and maybe even on the dryer, what you're going to find is that some of these threads will start to poke out a little bit, just like a little bit of thread. If you are confident in how you crocheted over them, like I showed you, or how you strongly put them going in between stitches for several inches, then you can be confident to cut off any little tiny bits that are left over. But if you sort of feel like maybe you didn't do a great job, which is okay, we're all beginners once, that's another reason for hand washing, because the agitation in the machine is what makes it more likely that the yarn is going to unravel. Hand washing, it's probably going to stay, in basically the same state, so you don't have to worry about it as much. And so now I'm going to cut this, and again, like I said, if I had been more prepared, I'd have my thread snips here instead of fabric shears, and voila, you now have a quilted crochet project with a shell edge. Now if you decided before that you just like that single crochet edge, it's the same process for weaving in the ends like we just did. So then you would be finished, and like I said, you can iron it, you can wash it. I prefer hand washing and drying flat. If you have any questions, please let me know. I'm sorry I couldn't be with you here this weekend, but I'm actually attending a virtual conference for my job, so I'll be checking in now and again. I can be reached at marie@undergroundcrafter.com with any questions. Thank you so much, and I look forward to seeing all the projects everyone comes up with. Have a great day.